It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night, I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area, nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a foolish idea since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign "Park closes at 10", and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down. So I lit my way with a mini maglite on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods, a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer had come hoping to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I didn't know if you'd ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from a fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this. A man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on my back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There was no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation, a young woman alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I drew his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at that time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot, if he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fudge it." And he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down, and still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. Creepy forest rapists, let's never meet again. This is going to be short, but a memory sprung into my mind a couple of days back, and I thought it would be worth sharing. I live in North Wales, UK. For anyone who has had the pleasure of visiting, it truly is a beautiful place to live, though for an adolescent boy it is certainly lacking in things to do. As a result, my friends and I would often find ourselves mindlessly exploring areas of the countryside and coastline. Despite it being quite sparsely populated in comparison to the closest cities, there is a dual carriageway running right along the coast from Wales into England. Also, train tracks run alongside this road for most of its course, occasionally passing overhead via a small cement bridge. Anyway, there was one night a few years ago when about 4 of us randomly decided to try and explore the inside of one of these bridges, as one of the group had observed a manhole cover nearby which we believed to be the entrance. On a closer inspection, we discovered that several tools would be required in order to gain entry. We returned with the necessary equipment and proceeded to unbolt the cover. This had to be done stealthily as the train track was right beside us. Not close enough to be of any danger, but definitely a sufficiently small distance to cause panic for any train driver, and panic usually means police. It wasn't long before we had removed the heavily steel disc and had started descending the ladder down into the structure. Once we had all safely reached the bottom, we decided to progress to the other side. At this point, we are totally confined into the narrow space that leads into the main area. If you're confused as to what the hell this bridge is supposed to be, you probably should be, because it was rather peculiar. I mean, I would have never known there was even an inside had we not found a manhole. So as we squeeze and crouch and at one point scrape along our bellies, to the other side of the structure there is a growing sense of claustrophobia between us. The distance from one end to the other is surprisingly long, but at a halfway point you can look down through narrow gaps into the motorway below. This was actually pretty cool, which helped keep us calm in a strange way. At this point, apart from the mild discomfort and confinement, we were just still a group of guys on an adventure. This was about to change dramatically. No more than a few meters beyond halfway, which we could tell due to the symmetry of the passageways through the bridge, one of us claimed they could see some object in the distance at the far end. Slightly hesitantly, we agreed to investigate, which is a very bad move. I reached the end first, and let me tell you, I have never felt the same sense of dread before or since. In front of me was a single far-away chair positioned facing a wall. On the wall was a partially torn page from a newspaper or a magazine, showing a fully naked lady in an erotic position. The reason I don't just refer to it as porn is because something was different about it. I can't put my finger on it, but it seemed more sinister than sexy, if that makes any sense. More disturbingly, the eyes of the woman displayed had been cut from the page, removed with precision, not just hastily ripped off. The scene that lay before us had rendered us completely speechless, and an overpowering sense of panic could be felt collectively. That was when we found a condom. The horrendous, gut-wrenching, blood-drenched condom. Needless to say, we got the F out of there as fast as humanly possible, smashing our knees and shins against the sharp cement edges that lined the path to the ladder by which we had entered. Of course, we were all praying to God that the manhole hadn't been resealed, as it was impossible to tell until you reached the ladder itself. Thankfully, the exit route was clear, and we promptly dashed as far away as our legs could carry us. I'm sure this ending comes as a disappointment to some of you reading this, as we luckily never bumped into the twisted individual who sits in that chair. But I must stress how radically out of the norm this was given where I live. The reason I mentioned the population earlier was with purpose. There are easily enough people here to escape the realms of crazy country folk, yet nowhere near enough people to have someone clearly lose grip on society without somebody taking notice. For example, there was literally only one homeless man whom everyone in the area knew and grew fond of, eventually resulting in a mass gathering at his funeral when he passed away. I sometimes think, though, not recently as I had more or less forgotten about that night entirely, about a person who climbs down into that bridge and navigates through the darkness to sit facing a wall and do God knows what that ends up with a condom full of blood. You honestly couldn't envision a more surreal situation. It has just come to my realization that what we unearthed that night has not once been uttered to another soul. As a naive teenager, it was the type of thing you just wanted to forget. But thinking about, we probably should have let police or at least someone know about what was down there, because it wasn't the doings of a healthy-minded individual. Before I start, here's a bit of context to my story. My husband and I lived in a small 2-floor house with 2 main entrances, one along the front and the other on the side of the house, which opens up into the laundry room. When we're too busy or it's too late to walk our dog, we hook his collar onto a long line that's attached to one of the pipes in the corner of our house so he can use the bathroom. We used to do this from the door in our laundry room, but we'd noticed that large steps from the door to the ground had been taking a toll on his hips. As a result, we started letting him out through the front door instead, since the porch is much closer to the ground. This particular night, I was home alone with my dog, and it was around midnight when I decided to let him outside one last time before going to bed. I hooked him up on his line, closed the door, and locked it, before heading into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was pretty routine. Even if he used the bathroom quickly, he liked to walk around along the front and side of the house for a few minutes before coming back inside. As I'm putting away the dishes, I hear a scratch on the door, how my dog signals when he wants to come inside. So I head over to let him back in. Since I've watched way too many scary movies, I always look through the door's peephole before opening the door. Out of habit, I look to check that my dog is in front of the door. Instead, I see a man staring very intently at the door handle. I freeze with my hand on the door handle. I don't know how much time went by, but then I heard another scratch, this one louder than the last. This kind of wakes me up from my initial shock, and I run to grab my cell phone. I call my husband to tell him what's happening. He was very confused. I probably wasn't explaining the situation very well, but says that he's heading home. This is when I realize my dog is still outside with this person. I head back to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible to check whether the stranger is still there. Just like before, he's standing there, head bowed, looking at a doorknob. I tiptoe over to the laundry room, and slowly opened the door as quietly as possible. I can't see my dog anywhere, and the side of my house is covered in gravel. I knew I couldn't step outside without making a lot of noise. With my heart still pounding in my chest, I go to the front door to keep an eye on the stranger and to get a better look at him. I considered calling the police, but I didn't feel they would take me seriously since all this man was doing was standing in front of my house. I tried taking a picture of him with my cell phone, but my camera was only able to take a picture of the peephole and not the images behind the glass. All of a sudden, the man looks up directly at me. I swear he knew I was there. He glares at me, then opens his mouth to show this taunting, malicious grin. He stood there that way for a few seconds. With that, he turns around and starts to walk down the street. I stay in the same place, almost expecting him to rush back and start pounding on the door. Luckily, my husband got back after a few minutes. Long story short, he convinced me to call the police and went out looking for our dog. It turns out this man had cut the end of the line connected to the pipe, and our dog decided that this was a good time for him to explore my neighbor's backyard, which was where we found him. It's been 3 years since this happened. We've since moved to a new house, for unrelated reasons, and the police weren't able to come up with any suspects. Ever since then, we took our dog on very long walks before the sun goes down.